You walked out of that room, and the conversation inside your head continued for hours, maybe days. You replayed what you said, what you didn't say, how you were perceived, running the footage in careful, obsessive detail. The room had already moved on within minutes. That gap between how much space a moment occupies in your interior world and how little it occupies in anyone else's is not a wound inflicted by cruelty or judgment. It is something quieter and more disorienting than that. Nobody was judging you as harshly as you feared. They weren't judging you much at all. And that is the brutal reality most people never fully absorb, because indifference is harder to process than rejection. Rejection at least confirms you were seen. Indifference suggests something more unsettling, that the audience you've been performing for, the one that has quietly shaped your decisions and silenced your instincts for years, may have never been watching the way you believed. So the question isn't what they thought of you. The question is what you were actually doing all that time. There is a specific kind of man who does not start the project, not because he lacks the discipline, not because he has calculated the risk and found it too steep. He stops before the calculation. He stops at the image of what beginning would look like to someone observing him. He edits himself in advance for a verdict that hasn't been requested by people too absorbed in their own silent performances to notice his. This is the spotlight effect, not as a psychological curiosity, but as a structural force in a man's actual life. It is not occasional. It operates constantly, quietly, at the level of micro-decisions, the email not sent, the opinion held back in the meeting, the business idea that never graduated from a note on a phone to a first real step. Each one felt at the time like restraint, like measured caution. In the language of the male mindset, it was framed as strategy, as not overextending, not exposing weakness. But the harsh truth underneath that framing is more uncomfortable. It was a transaction. Something real was exchanged for social safety that was never at risk. The brutal reality of this mechanism is not that others judge harshly. They rarely do. They are too occupied with their own management, their own careful staging of a life that looks appropriate, considered, under control. The meeting where the opinion was suppressed, everyone in that room was making the same calculation, everyone performing restraint, everyone mistaking their audience's silence for scrutiny. And then there are years. Not dramatic years, not years marked by visible failure or public loss. Quiet years. Years shaped by the accumulated weight of small withdrawals from a life that could have moved forward, but chose instead to wait for conditions that already existed. The conditions were already there. The audience was not. Consider the man who returns, alone, to a creative project he stopped, a piece of writing, a business model, a conversation he rehearsed 30 times and never had. He does not experience it as regret in the conventional sense. What he feels is stranger and harder to name, a recognition that the pause was not temporary, that the project did not stop because the world intervened. It stopped in the silence between two decisions, the moment after he understood what he needed to do, and the moment he chose instead to manage how it would appear if he tried and fell short. The audience he feared was a projection. The opportunity cost was real. This is not a lesson about building confidence. Confidence is the wrong frame entirely. This is about economy. A man operates with a fixed reserve of time, clarity, and forward momentum. An enormous portion of that reserve, in the average life, a structurally significant portion, is spent on the management of other people's perceptions. Perceptions they are not forming. Perceptions belonging to people who, at this exact moment, are spending their own reserves managing the impression they make on him. Everyone performing, no one watching. The system runs at full cost with no output. The quiet nausea of this recognition is not guilt, it is something more precise. The awareness that one's own caution, so carefully maintained, so intelligently rationalized, was not wisdom, it was a performance. It had an audience of one, and that audience was never as critical as it was cast.
There is a man who has told a version of his life story many times. He has noticed something recently. He keeps stopping the story at the same point, not because he runs out of material, because he has begun to see how it ends, and the ending does not fit the narrative he has been building around the choices he made when he thought someone was watching. He stops telling the story because he has noticed the pattern. That is the beginning of something, or the beginning of a more sophisticated performance. How many of the decisions made in the last several years were actually made by the man who exists, and how many were made by the version of him trying to remain acceptable to a room that had already moved on? That question does not need to be answered immediately. It tends to answer itself. Most people don't really know how they exist in other people's minds, not the curated version, the actual one, the version assembled without their input, formed in seconds, rarely revisited. That version of you is mostly fiction, not because others are careless, because that's the nature of social perception, a field where dark psychology quietly operates every time two people share the same room. What people retain of you is not a summary, it is an impression, formed in the specific moment they were paying attention, colored by whatever they were already carrying that day. The dinner 5 years ago, the stumble, the pause before the apology, you have returned to it. You have reconstructed it, re-examined it, revised it. The other guests moved on before the evening ended. They were too occupied managing their own performance to retain yours. This is not comforting. It is something stranger. Memory does not record what happened. It records what landed. Not the speech someone prepared, the one nervous gesture during it, not the point someone made, the way their voice shifted 3 seconds before they made it. Memory is impressionistic, selective, and almost entirely self-referential. What people carry of you is filtered through the mood they were in the day you entered their awareness, through the preoccupation that was already occupying most of their attention, through the lens of what they had decided about people like you long before you arrived. This is the harsh truth that most accountability conversations never reach. The version of you that lives in someone else's mind is not really about you at all. Here is where the brutality of this reality becomes precise. If other people's perceptions of you are fragmentary, assembled from incomplete data, projected anxieties, and a handful of impressions captured at unrepresentative moments, then the effort to control those perceptions is not social intelligence. It is something quieter and more costly, a kind of magical thinking. The belief that sustained vigilance over one's external presentation can govern what lives inside another person's mind. It cannot. And yet, some people spend years in that attempt, calibrating language before speaking it, rehearsing interpretations before anyone has asked, not because something went wrong, because some part of them suspects that if they lower their attention for a moment, the wrong impression might calcify somewhere. Think of two people at a social gathering. One is monitoring, carefully, every word chosen, every reaction absorbed and analyzed in real time, the body language read, the silences interpreted. They are performing for an audience they believe is watching. The other person is thinking about a payment they forgot to make, or a conversation from that morning they haven't finished processing, or what they're going to eat when they get home. They are not watching. They were never watching. They are a parallel interior monologue that happens to be temporarily occupying the same physical space. The uncomfortable inversion, the one that doesn't arrive loudly, is this. Most people are not indifferent to you out of coldness. They are indifferent to you because they are entirely absorbed in managing their own performance, for their own imagined audience, which in some cases may be you. The social world is not a theater where some people watch and others perform. Everyone is performing. The seats are empty in every direction. What makes this psychologically significant, beyond the obvious relief it might appear to offer, is the grief that follows the understanding. Because if no one has been watching as carefully as feared, then a significant portion of the mental energy spent managing appearances was spent in response to a threat that didn't exist. The reputation you were protecting, the impression you were correcting, the version of you that you were certain had been permanently registered in someone's perception, mostly fiction. Ask yourself one question, not as an exercise, but with actual precision. What would change about how you moved through today if you knew with certainty that no one would remember any of it in 6 months? Not the decisions, not the choices that carry real consequence. The performance, the calibration, the quiet exhaustion of managing how you appear. Whatever surfaces in the space after that question, that is where the real work is. Lesson 3. The fear that needed an audience to survive. There is a particular kind of fear that does not exist in solitude. It lives in the space between a person and their imagined observers, in the anticipated judgment, the expected criticism, the projected evaluation that hasn't happened yet and may never happen. Most people who carry this kind of social anxiety believe they are avoiding failure. They are not. They are managing perception. The distinction matters more than it first appears, because one of those problems can be solved alone, in silence, and the other dissolves the moment the room empties. A person who won't begin a project because people will criticize it has built a functional system. The fear of being judged explains the inaction. The inaction protects against judgment. The architecture holds. But remove the audience, remove the imagined gaze, and the structure becomes visible for what it is. Not a protective response to an external threat, but an internal arrangement, a way of making avoidance feel reasonable. This is the quiet mechanics of dark psychology turned inward. Not manipulation of others, manipulation of oneself, executed with precision, largely without recognition. The social layer of this fear is convincing because it's partly true. People do judge. Criticism is real. Misunderstanding happens. But the credibility of the fear is not the same as its function. And its function, examined honestly, is to provide an explanation for staying still that exists outside the self. When judgment is the obstacle, inaction becomes a form of wisdom. When the audience disappears, that logic collapses. What remains in the silence is the harder question. There is a specific moment, and many who watch this video will know it exactly, when someone sits alone with everything they need to begin something they have delayed for years. The room is quiet. No one is watching. The materials are there. The knowledge is there. And nothing happens. The silence is not freeing. It is clarifying. It reveals without ceremony that the obstacle was never outside the room. This is the confrontation that the social fear exists to prevent. Not failure in front of others, unwitnessed failure. The possibility of trying with no audience and no external explanation available, and discovering that the absence of the crowd changes nothing, that the work still doesn't get done, that the reluctance runs deeper than performance anxiety or social fear or any of the named things. That confrontation is harder to carry than the fear it replaces. It has no external address. Here, the narrative takes a darker turn, one that resists comfortable psychological framing. The belief that judgment is the enemy of action has it precisely backwards. For a significant portion of people, the possibility of being watched is the only condition under which they come close to beginning at all. The anticipated audience, the imagined critic, the envisioned admirer is not just a source of anxiety, it is a source of activation. Remove the witness, and the motivation to act, even for oneself, can quietly collapse. Some people are not trying to escape the audience, they are trying to earn its attention. And when the audience turns out to be a fiction, when it becomes clear that most people are far too occupied with their own self-presentation to scrutinize another's choices closely, the animating question surfaces. Who exactly is this for? That question, unresolved and private, is more threatening than any external critic. It disrupts the story a person has been telling about their own psychology. It suggests that what felt like fear of judgment was, underneath, a kind of hunger for it. That the scrutiny they claimed to dread was also the structure that kept them engaged. The person who fears being seen and the person who cannot act without being seen are not opposites. They are often the same person, navigating the same unexamined need from opposite directions. What is left when both the imagined critic and the imagined admirer are removed is only the question of motivation itself. Not what others will think, not how it will appear, but what the real reason is, the one that doesn't require a witness to remain coherent. That answer rarely arrives quickly, and some people, if they are being precise with themselves, are not sure it arrives at all. Lesson 4. What you build when no one is watching. There is a version of a person that exists only when someone else is in the room. It is not a false version exactly, but it is a performed one, assembled under the pressure of observation, maintained by the awareness of being seen. Remove that awareness, and something shifts, not dramatically, quietly, in the small adjustments that cost nothing visible and accumulate over years into something that cannot be easily named but can eventually be felt. Most people have an intellectual understanding of this. Fewer have looked at it with any precision. The structure of it is this: effort tends to organize itself around feedback. When feedback is immediate and social, when someone is watching, when the result will be evaluated, the effort rises to meet it. When feedback is absent or delayed or private, the effort contracts to a more honest level, not to zero, but to something that reflects a person's actual relationship with their own standards, rather than their relationship to the impression they create. That contraction, repeated over thousands of unobserved hours, is not a moral failure. It is a structural one, and its consequences are not felt immediately. They accumulate. Consider two people with roughly equivalent starting points, similar intelligence, similar early circumstances, similar stated ambitions. One has organized their effort around what will be visible, the preparation that looks thorough, the work that reads as competent, the presentation polished enough to pass. The other has organized their effort around what will be built, in the silent hours, with no immediate audience, with no performance to sustain. Years later, the gap between them is legible, but the specific mechanism that produced it is invisible to almost everyone who observes the outcome, including, often, the person who lived it. This is the brutal reality of private discipline. It leaves no visible record while it is happening, only the result. The harder layer arrives here, and it is the one that tends to be avoided most carefully. The indifference of others, the fact that no one was watching as feared, is not simply a freedom, it is also a mirror. In the absence of an audience, there is no performance to hide behind. What was done in private was done for no reason except the internal one, and the quality of it is the truest available measure of what a person actually values, as opposed to what they claim. Most people have not looked at that measure directly. It is one of the more uncomfortable confrontations available, not because it reveals moral corruption, but because it reveals the specific gap between a person's self-concept and their actual behavior when the social consequence is removed. Silent power is not built in public. It never was. The person who has practiced appearing capable over years in enough observed contexts can become genuinely convincing to others and to themselves. But capability built primarily in performance contexts has a particular fragility. It depends on the scaffolding of observation to hold its shape. Remove the context, and what remains is what was actually constructed in private, not what was intended. what was built. The question that this produces, quietly, without announcement, is an inventory, not a dramatic reckoning, something more patient and slightly merciless than that. An examination of the unobserved hours, what was actually done there, day by day, in the absence of feedback, in the absence of witness, in the absence of any reason to perform. The answer to that question is not what a person hoped to become. It is what they have been, in practice, becoming all along. The indifference of others was never the point. It was only the condition, the cleared space in which something more important becomes visible. What a person does with unobserved freedom is not a minor detail of character. It is the character. Not the version assembled for rooms with witnesses, or the one rehearsed in anticipation of judgment, but the one that persists when the last reason to perform has quietly left. This video was never about other people. It was about the specific, private question of what has been built in their absence. Not what was intended, not what was planned or imagined to described to someone who asked. What was actually constructed in the silent hours with no audience, with nothing at stake except the truth of it. That question doesn't require an answer tonight, but it has been open for longer than most people are comfortable admitting. And it remains open now, in a room where no one is watching.